Muchísimas gracias, Andrés. Muchísimas gracias a todos ustedes. El español fue mi primera lengua extranjera que estudié en la escuela secundaria, pero voy a hablar inglés. I'm very, very pleased to be here to talk about my passion, my love for language. I love Spanish so much in high school that I studied another language, German, in college, and then Portuguese and French, and it's just become the consuming passion of my life. To this day, I'll often miss my own subway stop coming home from work because I'll be reading a book of Palestinian Arabic grammar or an article about Koine Greek, and then I realize I'm at the wrong stop. I've missed my own home by a couple of stops, and I call my wife and say, sorry, it happened again. I'm coming back on the train coming home. So I love language. It's my favorite thing in the world, really. And yet, when I started to write my own book about language, I started to write about what other people say and think about language. And in particular, what surprised me and what I didn't quite understand is why so many people were anxious or angry about language. This book here, Eat, Shoots, and Leaves, by the British author Lynn Truss, has sold millions of copies. And it's a book about punctuation, about the use of the comma and the quotation mark and the apostrophe and the period. And it's best described as a furious book. Lynn Truss says that people who misuse apostrophes, for example, should be struck by lightning, hacked to pieces, and buried in a shallow grave. Now, this is someone who claims to love language, and I love language, and I don't understand. I can't feel this fury, this anger, this frustration about the language being used around Lynn Truss. Why she's looking around and seeing such frustration and anger when I look around and just see wonder. I love different ways of speaking. I love hearing a new accent I've never heard before, learning a new word I've never heard, a piece of slang. I'm an explorer. I like to keep my mind open to all kinds of language. And yet this tradition, the tradition I like to call the stickler tradition, the grammar grouch, instead enjoys looking down on how others use language. And so I push back against that in my book. But I do understand where some of this fury and this anxiety about language being corrupted or going downhill comes from. There are a few metaphors that people use when they talk or when they think about language. And here's one. There's an old idea that language and thought are almost exactly the same thing, that we think in language. And this gave George Orwell the idea in his famous dystopian novel, 1984, from which this picture comes, the idea that in a future totalitarian society, if the government was powerful enough to change the language, if it could remove words like freedom from the vocabulary, that people would no longer be able to think about the concept of freedom. This metaphor that language is thought, and therefore with no word for freedom, you can have no thought for freedom, is very romantic, it's very powerful, and it's also very wrong. I think all of you probably know of a concept that you don't have a good word for, or you're remembering a word that's on the tip of your tongue but can't say it. In fact, for just a piece of comic proof that we have words for things, or we have thoughts for things we have no words for, there was the 1980s satirical television show in North America called Not Necessarily the News, and they had a recurring segment called Sniglets. Sniglets were words that don't appear in the dictionary but should. And so viewers of the show were invited to write in a word that didn't appear in the dictionary but should. For example, there was the diagonerd. The diagonerd is someone who parks diagonally across two parking spaces, thus taking up two instead of one. Now, the fact that somebody could come up with this word, despite there not being a word for it, really is just all the anecdotal evidence you need that we can, in fact, think of things that we don't have a word for. So language is not thought. You can't control the mind so easily. So here's another metaphor for language. Somebody like Lynn Truss is worried that if we leave out an apostrophe or we put in too many apostrophes, that our language will just crash, that we will not be able to communicate, that the system is so fragile that this minor error will cause catastrophe. Now, I've been learning a little bit of computer programming, and this is a bit of my JavaScript. If anyone out there is better than me at JavaScript and sees a problem in here, maybe come and tell me later. But I wrote this code, and I can tell you from my short experience with programming that if you leave out a single character, a single parenthesis, a curly bracket, and you spell a thing a single bit wrong, the whole program will malfunction. You need to have absolutely everything right because this is a highly literal and very brittle system in a way. You can't make a little mistake or it will cause wider mistakes. But language is not computer code. A tiny mistake will not cause our language to crash. This is a written passage from one of the great writers, the great philosophers and great statesmen of American history, Thomas Jefferson. And if you know your if you know your English grammar, you can see that there are two apostrophes in this passage where they should not be. We are disgusted with its deformity, that shouldn't have an apostrophe. And a soul candidly acknowledging its fault, that also should not have an apostrophe in modern standard English. Well, I'm glad Lynn Truss never met our third president, because she would be striking him with lightning, hacking him to pieces, and burying him in an unmarked grave for the catastrophe that is this misplaced apostrophe. And yet we can read this passage with no difficulty whatsoever. In Jefferson's time, the punctuation conventions were somewhat fluid, and they've changed since then, but the point is that language is always changing, and yet when we see small mistakes or small changes in happening, and in fact, most changes start as mistakes and then become standard. When we see things like this happening, our language doesn't crash like my little bit of JavaScript would if I had put in a typo. Another metaphor for language is law, that we must be precise because the risk of misunderstanding is so great that we must use words with utmost care all the time. And the reason is that the legal system is based on the adversarial principle, that if two parties to a contract disagree about whether the contract has been executed, then everything has to be so specific, spelled out in such detail that one party can sue the other into oblivion. The example I have up here is famously supposed to be the hardest sentence in the United States Tax Code. For purposes of paragraph 3, an organization described in paragraph 2 shall be deemed to include an organization described in section 501c, 4, 5, or 6, which would be described in paragraph 2 if it were an organization described in section 501c3. This is how you have to think about language if you were a lawyer, because any ambiguity in a contract, in a statute, or in some other legal document can have consequences, because there's another lawyer out there whose sole purpose in his life is finding that tiny mistake and opening it, crack, and exploiting it, and winning his case in a court of law. So this is adversarial thinking about language. This is not cooperation. I like to think of language a little bit more like this. A good speaker and a good listener are a little bit like a good dancer. You not only know what you want to accomplish with your language, you have to have a feel for your partner. You have to not, if somebody steps slightly out of the wrong way or steps slightly the wrong way, you don't stomp on their foot and stop dancing with them. You adjust, you react. You deal with different partners in different ways. And language is like that. Language is change. Language is variety. The idea that I resist is that there is only one form of language that is correct, and it must be used in only that form in all occasions. Rather, all of us know that there are ways you speak with family and friends at home. There are ways you speak when you're giving a presentation at a conference. There are ways you write formally, and there are ways you write informally. And we also should know to respect and react to our audience. Some of you might have traveled abroad and found yourself speaking your own language differently based on the way the people you're speaking with speak. For example, the American tourist goes to Ireland and all of a sudden finds himself speaking with this Irish accent that he never had before, and it's terrible, but he's trying to imitate the locals. Well, that's a good thing. That is a user of language trying to accommodate, trying to dance properly with the person he's speaking to. And that is something we should respect and we should honor. My father used to tell a joke, and I'm going to tell it to you now. It's about a country boy from Georgia, gets into the University of Georgia, and then on a special scholarship gets to take a trip up to Harvard University, perhaps the most prestigious university in the United States. And so his first time on campus, he's very nervous, but he meets a passing Harvard student. And he says, "Excuse me, can you tell me where the library is at?" And the Harvard man looks at him with a bit of a sneer and says, "We here at Harvard do not end a sentence with a preposition." So the Georgia boy scratches his head for a minute and says, "All right, let me try that again. Excuse me, can you tell me where the library is at, asshole?" Now, there's two things to like about this joke. First of all, there is a so-called rule that you're not supposed to end a sentence with a preposition in English, but that rule is completely bogus. It is a false rule. It was imported by certain early writers in English in the 17th and 18th centuries on the model of Latin. The poet and essayist John Dryden composed his own English works first in Latin and then translated them into English, and felt that the best English style was the one that looked most like Latin. And other writers took that idea up, and gradually we propagated this rule that is a foreign import into our language. The reason every English speaker ends sentences with prepositions is because it's a natural, organic, and ancient part of our language. This rule has no place. The joke exposes the falsity of the rule because the Georgia boy gets away with it by just adding one more word, asshole. But the best part of the joke is that the Harvard guy really is an asshole. To respond to an honest question, a request for help, for a visitor, someone you should greet with hospitality, with this sneer, with the attempt to find fault with his language, to look down on someone because they use a perfectly standard, correct sentence because of some pseudo rule that you were memorized, you were taught by your English high school teacher, is the ultimate in snobbery. So the Harvard man is wrong, the Georgia boy is right, not only on the grammar, but on the way we should think about language. My book, You Are What You Speak, is about the history of the idea of standard languages. And it traces the origin of our standard languages that really follow the origin of our national states. The creation of Spain created the one Spanish language centered on the Castilian of central Spain. The creation of French is really just the creation of a dialect that was superior to all other dialects and then extended to all corners of France. The creation of English was the success of one dialect of Southeastern English against all of the dialects of English in its time. In other words, yes, standard languages do exist, and our young people need to be taught to speak them and write them correctly. But variety is a fact of all languages at all times. At any one point in time, every society on earth is either multilingual or multidialectal or both. Variety is wonderful, it's beautiful, it's fascinating. And to walk around with your attitudes about language being that everyone who doesn't speak like me is doing it wrong is to be, frankly, an asshole. Instead of scorn, instead of anxiety, instead of frustration, the way to think about language, I think, is with an open mind, with a sense of humor, and most of all, with humility and a sense of wonder. Thank you very much.
Abra minute.